How leaders speak to command instant respect. Machiavelli.
There's a kind of person who can walk into a room, say only a few words, and somehow make everyone pay attention. Not because they shouted, not because they begged to be noticed, not because they tried to impress anyone, but because the way they speak carries something rare: weight. And in a world where most people talk too much, explain too much, laugh too much, and reveal too much, the person who speaks with control becomes dangerous. Because people do not only listen to words, they listen to certainty. They respond to authority. They respect what feels solid, unshaken, and deliberate. That is why some people can have the best ideas in the room and still be ignored, while another person says half as much and somehow becomes the one everyone follows. This is not luck. This is not charisma alone, and this is definitely not about having the loudest voice. This is about understanding one brutal truth. People judge power by how it sounds, and no one understood this better than Machiavelli. Machiavelli understood that leadership was never just about what you do, it was also about what people believe about you. And one of the fastest ways people decide whether to respect you is through the way they speak. Your tone, your timing, your silence, your certainty, your ability to say something simple and make it land like law. Because leaders are not just heard, they are felt. And if you have ever been overlooked, talked over, dismissed, or underestimated, then what you are about to hear may change the way you speak forever. Because tonight, we are going deep into the hidden language of authority, and by the end of this video, you will understand why weak speech kills respect, why over-explaining destroys your image, why powerful people use silence like a weapon, and how true leaders speak in ways that make people instinctively take them seriously. This is not about manipulation for vanity. This is about presence. This is about command. This is about learning how to speak in a way that makes the world pause. Welcome to Truth 001, and tonight, we study how leaders speak to command instant respect.
Respect is not asked for, it is signaled. One of the biggest mistakes people make is believing respect comes from being nice enough, smart enough, or good enough. It doesn't, not automatically. Because human beings are not purely rational. They do not first analyze your character, your intentions, or your intelligence. They react first to what they sense. And what they sense is often based on your signals, how you carry yourself, how you respond under pressure, and above all, how you speak. Before people know whether you are competent, they ask themselves a more primitive question. Does this person seem sure of themselves? Because certainty creates psychological gravity, and uncertainty repels respect. That means two people can know the exact same thing, but the one who speaks with hesitation, nervous laughter, endless explanation, and approval-seeking energy will almost always be treated as lower status. Not because they are less intelligent, but because they are signaling weakness. And Machiavelli understood something modern people still struggle to accept. Perception often comes before truth. If people perceive you as unsure, they will test you. If people perceive you as emotionally fragile, they will push you. If people perceive that your words are soft, unstable, and constantly adjusting to please the room, they may smile at you, but deep down, they will not fear disappointing you. They will not hesitate to challenge you, and they will not instinctively respect your authority. This is why many intelligent people remain invisible, because they think being right is enough. But leadership is not only about being right. Leadership is also about being believed, and people believe what sounds anchored. Think about it. When someone says, I'm not really sure, but I think maybe we could possibly try this if everyone agrees. That may sound polite, but it does not sound like leadership. Now compare it to, this is the direction we're taking. Here's why. Short, clear, contained. The second person may know no more than the first, but one sounds like they are waiting for permission, and the other sounds like they have already made peace with responsibility. That is the difference. And this is where many people lose respect without even realizing it, not because they are foolish, but because their speech is full of hidden surrender. They use too many disclaimers, too many apologies, too many nervous fillers, too many verbal escape routes. And every time you do that, you unconsciously tell the world, please don't hold me too strongly to what I'm saying. But leaders do the opposite. Leaders speak in a way that says, I have thought this through. I stand by what I'm saying. You may disagree, but you will not shake me easily. That is powerful. And the truth is, people do not always remember the exact words you used, but they remember the energy behind them. They remember whether your words felt grounded or needy, whether your speech felt measured or frantic, whether your voice made them feel they were in the presence of someone stable or someone seeking validation. And this matters more than most people realize, because the world is constantly ranking social strength, quietly, instantly, subconsciously. And your voice is one of the first things it uses to judge you. That means if you want more respect, you must stop thinking of speech as just talking. It is not just talking. It is signaling rank. It is signaling control. It is signaling whether or not people should take you seriously. And the moment you understand that, you stop speaking casually. You stop throwing words around. You stop over-explaining yourself to people who have not earned access to your mind. And you begin to understand one of Machiavelli's quietest lessons. A leader does not speak to be liked first. A leader speaks to establish position. That does not mean cruelty. It means clarity. It means control. It means understanding that if your words do not carry structure, your presence will not carry weight. And in a world full of noise, the person who speaks with deliberate force becomes unforgettable.
The first rule of powerful speech: never sound needy. If you want to lose respect quickly, there is one emotional scent you must remove from your speech immediately, and that scent is neediness. Neediness in speech is one of the fastest ways to collapse your authority. Because the moment people sense that you need their approval, need their validation, need their acceptance, your power drops immediately. And the dangerous part is this: most people do not sound needy on purpose. They sound needy because they are trying to be accepted. They are trying to avoid conflict. They are trying not to offend anyone. They are trying to make sure everybody likes them. So they soften every sentence. They over-explain every opinion. They smile after every serious point. They keep adding just, maybe, kind of, I guess, and if that's okay. And before they know it, their speech no longer sounds like conviction. It sounds like negotiation. Let's be honest. There are people who cannot even state a basic opinion without wrapping it in emotional bubble wrap. They cannot say, I disagree. They say, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I kind of feel like maybe there's another way to look at it. That is not diplomacy. That is fear wearing polite clothes. And people can feel it, even if they cannot explain it. Because when you constantly cushion your speech, what you are really saying is, I am afraid of your reaction. And the moment your speech reveals fear, respect begins to evaporate. Machiavelli would have understood this instantly, because power has always depended on one central illusion, the illusion that you are not easily moved. Not that you are emotionless, not that you are cold, but that your center does not shake every time someone disagrees with you. A leader who sounds emotionally dependent on the room will never fully command the room, because people instinctively trust those who seem internally anchored. That is why truly respected people often sound calm, not performative. They do not rush to feel silence. They do not panic when challenged. They do not instantly defend themselves against every misunderstanding. They do not chase agreement like hungry salesmen. They say what they mean, and then they let it sit. That is power. Because one of the strongest forms of communication is the ability to speak without begging the room to clap for your existence. And if that sounds harsh, good, because many people have been trained to speak like emotional petitioners. They have been taught to package every truth in a way that offends no one, disturbs no one, and threatens no one. But if your speech never carries force, then your leadership never carries consequence. And without consequence, there is no authority. Think of it this way. Every time you over-explain yourself to someone who is already disrespecting you, you lower your own market value. Every time you desperately try to convince people who enjoy misunderstanding you, you bleed status. Every time you keep talking long after your point was already made, you begin to sound less powerful, not more. This is why some people destroy their own image by saying too much, because they think more words equals more control. But often, the opposite is true. The more desperate you sound to be understood, the less powerful you appear. Leaders understand this. They know that not every misunderstanding deserves correction. Not every accusation deserves a courtroom defense. Not every challenge deserves emotional labor. Sometimes the strongest thing you can say is simply, "That's not accurate," and stop there. No panic, no performance, no spiraling, no need to prove your humanity to people committed to reducing it. That kind of speech is powerful because it communicates something deeper than words, self-possession. And self-possession is magnetic. Because most people are not in control of themselves. They are in control of their image only when things are easy. But the moment tension enters the room, they unravel. Their tone changes, their speech becomes messy, their energy starts pleading, and that is when they lose authority. But the person who remains composed under friction, that person becomes unforgettable. So if you want to speak like a leader, you must remove the emotional hunger from your voice. You must stop speaking from the desperate need to be approved, understood, or constantly affirmed. Because respect does not grow around desperation. Respect grows around containment. The ability to hold your own energy, to hold your point, to hold your ground, without collapsing into explanation addiction. And once you master that, people begin to hear you differently, because now your words are no longer asking for space, they are taking it. Powerful people do not explain everything. One of the clearest differences between weak speech and powerful speech is this. Weak people explain too much. Powerful people explain only what is necessary. This is one of the hardest truths for people to accept, because over-explanation often feels intelligent, it feels responsible, it feels like maturity. But in many cases, it is actually anxiety. And anxiety has a sound. It sounds like endless clarification. It sounds like trying to cover every possible misunderstanding before it happens. It sounds like giving 10 reasons when one would have been enough. It sounds like trying to convince people who have already decided how they want to see you. And once again, Machiavelli would not be surprised by this, because he understood that excessive transparency can weaken authority, not because secrecy is always good, but because power depends on preserving mystique, distance, and control of narrative. The more you explain every move, every feeling, every decision, every motive, the less commanding you become. Why? Because over-explanation signals that you feel indebted to everyone's comfort, and leaders cannot lead from a place of emotional debt. Let's make this practical. Imagine someone asks why you made a decision. A weak response sounds like this. Well, I just thought maybe it would be better because of what happened before, and because I didn't want anyone to feel bad, and I also considered a lot of other options. Now, maybe all of that is true, but it sounds messy. It sounds like someone trying to justify their right to choose. Now, listen to this. I made the decision based on what serves the long-term goal best. That is cleaner. That is stronger. That is leadership. Notice the difference. The second response does not feel defensive. It does not feel eager to be forgiven. It does not sound like someone asking for emotional permission, and that is what makes it powerful. A leader understands that if you explain every detail of your thinking to everyone, you lose edge, you lose mystique, you lose the natural authority that comes from restraint. This is especially important when dealing with disrespectful people, because some people do not ask questions to understand you, they ask questions to wear you down. They ask for explanations not because they are confused, but because they want to pull you into a lower frame. They want you defending, justifying, proving, scrambling, and the moment you enter that energy, you lose altitude. This is why strong communicators know when to stop. They know when a sentence is enough. They know when a boundary does not require a thesis. They know when no is complete. They know when that won't work is enough. They know when I've made my decision should be the end of the discussion. Because every extra sentence after your point is already clear can become a leak in your authority. And many people leak constantly. They explain their standards. They explain their boundaries. They explain their silence. They explain their confidence. They explain why they are no longer available. They explain why they are no longer tolerating nonsense. And the more they explain it, the less solid it sounds. There is something deeply powerful about a person who can make a decision, state it clearly, and remain emotionally unmoved by the discomfort it creates. That kind of person is hard to manipulate, and because they are hard to manipulate, they are respected. Do not misunderstand this. This does not mean becoming robotic.
It does not mean never elaborating. It does not mean refusing healthy communication. It means understanding the difference between clarity and compulsive self-justification. One is strength, the other is fear. And fear has a way of making people talk themselves out of their own power. So the next time you feel the urge to explain yourself excessively, pause. Ask yourself, am I clarifying or am I trying to earn acceptance? Because if your speech is secretly trying to earn emotional permission, then you are no longer speaking from power. You are speaking from insecurity. And insecurity is expensive. It costs you respect. It costs you authority. It costs you presence. But the moment you learn to say what is necessary and leave the rest unspoken, your words become heavier, cleaner, sharper, and far more difficult to dismiss. Because one of the strongest traits a person can develop is the ability to speak with enough confidence to leave silence behind their words.
Silence is part of the message. Most people are uncomfortable with silence. That is why they keep talking. And that is exactly why silence is powerful. Because what most people fear, leaders learn to use. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is pressure. Silence is space. Silence is composure made visible. And when used correctly, silence can say more about your power than 100 perfect sentences. Machiavelli understood that leadership is not only about action, it is also about timing. When to move, when to wait, when to reveal, when to withhold. And silence is one of the most strategic forms of withholding, because the person who is comfortable being silent is often the person least controlled by the room. Think about how revealing this is. When someone interrupts you, challenges you, questions you, or tries to provoke you, and you instantly rush to respond, what are you unconsciously communicating? You can move me whenever you want. But when someone speaks, and you pause, when you let the moment breathe, when you look at them without panic, when you answer only after you have chosen your words, you communicate something else entirely. I respond on my own terms. That is authority. Silence disrupts people, especially manipulative people, because manipulative people feed on reaction. They want emotional immediacy. They want your unfiltered energy. They want to pull you into their rhythm. But silence denies them access. Silence forces them to sit in uncertainty, and uncertainty makes many people reveal themselves. This is why powerful communicators often use pauses deliberately, not because they forgot what to say, but because they understand that speed is not strength, control is strength. And one of the strongest things you can do in conversation is refuse to be rushed, refuse to be emotionally dragged, refuse to let someone else's urgency become your instability. A leader does not always answer immediately. A leader does not always react visibly. A leader does not feel compelled to perform a response for the comfort of the room. That level of internal control changes everything, because people begin to feel that your emotions are not publicly available on demand, and that creates respect. It also creates mystery, and mystery increases perceived power. Why? Because people cannot easily dominate what they cannot quickly read. This is one reason low-value people often overshare everything. They narrate every thought, every feeling, every insecurity, every reaction. And while that may create familiarity, it often destroys gravitas, because gravitas requires containment. There must be some emotional depth people cannot instantly access. There must be some part of you that does not spill on command, and silence protects that. Silence gives your words shape. It gives your thoughts room to land. It makes people lean in. And in communication, making people lean in is far more powerful than chasing them with endless speech. Think of the strongest speakers you have ever heard. The most memorable ones are rarely the fastest. They are rarely the most frantic. They are rarely trying to impress you with endless verbal acrobatics. They speak, pause, and let the sentence hit. That pause is not empty. It is dominance over tempo. And the person who controls tempo often controls perception. So if you want to command more respect, learn how to stop filling every silence with fear. Learn how to let your point sit. Learn how to look unbothered by the space after your words, because often that space is where your authority becomes visible. And once you become comfortable with silence, you stop sounding like someone trying to be heard and start sounding like someone worth listening to.
Most people think leadership begins with status, but often it begins with speech, with tone, with restraint, with emotional control, with the discipline to stop speaking like someone asking for permission to exist. Because respect is not only earned through actions over time, sometimes it is felt instantly by the way a person opens their mouth. And what we have covered so far is only the beginning, because in the next part, we are going even deeper. We will break down why leaders never sound defensive, how calm speech creates fear and admiration, the Machiavellian art of saying less and meaning more, and how to speak in conflict without ever losing your frame. If you've been enjoying this so far, stay with me, because this next part is where most people will begin to realize why they have been respected less than they deserve.
Leaders never sound defensive. There is a certain weakness that instantly lowers a person's status, and that weakness is defensiveness. The moment a person becomes overly defensive in the way they speak, something shifts in the room. People may not say it out loud, but they feel it. Because defensiveness reveals something powerful. It reveals that your center is being controlled from the outside. And the moment people sense they can control your emotional state through words, your authority begins to collapse. This is one of the biggest differences between people who are respected and people who are constantly tested. The tested person reacts. The respected person responds. And that difference is everything. Most people do not even realize how often they speak from a defensive frame. They do it when they feel misunderstood. They do it when someone questions their intentions. They do it when they feel accused, judged, criticized, or doubted. And suddenly, their speech changes. They become quicker, longer, more emotional, more chaotic. Their voice begins to explain, justify, defend, and prove. And in that moment, they are no longer leading the conversation. They are being dragged by it. Machiavelli would have recognized this immediately, because in power, one of the most dangerous things you can do is allow your enemies, critics, or doubters to dictate your emotional rhythm. The moment your speech becomes reactive, you are no longer standing above the frame. You are trapped inside it. And once you are trapped inside someone else's frame, you are already weaker than you appear. This is why strong leaders do not rush to defend themselves every time they are questioned. Not because they are arrogant, not because they are incapable of explanation, but because they understand a deeper truth. Not every challenge deserves emotional access to you. Some people ask questions to understand. Others ask questions to destabilize. And if you do not know the difference, you will waste your power trying to defend yourself to people who never intended to hear you fairly. This is where many people lose respect without even realizing it, because they think, if I just explain myself clearly enough, they'll finally understand me. But that is often a fantasy. Some people understand you perfectly. They simply enjoy watching you squirm. They enjoy making you defend obvious things. They enjoy pulling you into long emotional explanations because every extra sentence weakens your image. And if you are not careful, you begin to participate in your own reduction. This is why leaders learn the discipline of non-defensive speech. And non-defensive speech has a very specific energy. It sounds like this. That's your interpretation. You're entitled to that view. That's not what happened. You can disagree. I said what I said. Now notice what these responses have in common. They are not frantic, they are not apologetic, they are not collapsing into panic. They do not sound like someone fighting for survival in the court of public opinion. They sound like someone who knows their center cannot be taken by force. That is power, because one of the highest forms of strength is the ability to remain unshaken when someone is trying to define you. And this matters in every area of life, in work, in relationships, in leadership, in family, in conflict, in business, everywhere. Because the world is constantly testing emotional structure. It wants to know, can this person hold themselves when pressure enters the room? Can they remain composed when misunderstood? Can they stay measured when criticized? Can they stay calm when someone tries to provoke them? Can they still sound grounded when tension rises? If the answer is no, then people stop seeing you as a force. Because unstable speech creates unstable perception. And perception matters, especially when you are trying to lead. Understand this clearly. Defensiveness is not just an emotional problem. It is a status problem. The more you sound like you are trying to rescue your image, the more people subconsciously assume your image is weak. But when you can hear criticism without instantly losing your structure, something changes. You begin to feel more dangerous, more difficult to manipulate, more difficult to shake, and the world treats you accordingly. So if you want to command instant respect, train yourself to stop speaking like someone on trial.
Stop acting like every misunderstanding is a courtroom emergency. Stop performing your innocence to people who are committed to their own version of you. Because one of the strongest signals you can ever send is this: you do not have the power to emotionally rearrange me. That is what leaders communicate. Not always through force, not always through dominance, but through emotional non-cooperation. They do not volunteer their nervous system to every argument. They do not become frantic because someone disapproves. They do not start bleeding words because tension appears. They stay structured, and structure creates respect. Calm speech feels more powerful than loud speech. Many people confuse power with volume. They think authority sounds loud, aggressive, sharp, explosive. They think the person with the most forceful energy must be the strongest person in the room, but that is often false, because in many cases, the loudest person in the room is not the most powerful. They are simply the least regulated, and that is a dangerous thing to misunderstand. True authority rarely needs to scream. True power does not need to thrash around to prove itself. True leadership often sounds calm, measured, precise, and almost unsettling in its restraint. That is because calmness under pressure communicates something primal. I am not threatened, and there are few signals more powerful than that. Think about it. When two people are in conflict and one becomes louder, faster, more emotional, more chaotic, while the other remains composed, deliberate, and clear, who appears more in control? It is almost never the louder one, because loudness often exposes emotional dependence on the moment. It exposes urgency, it exposes instability, it exposes the need to overpower instead of the ability to command. Machiavelli would have understood this as a form of psychological dominance, because if you can remain calm while others lose control, you automatically rise above them in perception, not because you are morally better, but because you appear more dangerous. Why dangerous? Because calm people are harder to predict, harder to read, harder to provoke, harder to manipulate, and the human mind instinctively respects what it cannot easily throw off balance. This is why calm speech carries such force. It does not beg for attention, it creates gravity. It pulls attention toward itself, and that is a completely different kind of power. A person who can say something serious without raising their voice often commands more respect than the person shouting for dominance, because shouting often exposes insecurity disguised as strength. It says, I need to increase volume because my internal authority is not enough. But calm speech says, I do not need to perform power, I have it. That difference is massive, and once you understand it, you begin to hear people differently. You begin to notice who is speaking from actual control, and who is simply making noise to compensate for the absence of it. You will see this everywhere, in meetings, on social media, in arguments, in politics, in relationships. The people who feel least powerful often speak with the most unnecessary intensity, because they are trying to manufacture force externally. But force that must be manufactured constantly is not real force, it is performance. And performance cannot hold up under pressure forever. Sooner or later the mask slips. That is why leaders train their nervous systems, not just their words. Because if your nervous system is weak, your speech will betray you. Your mouth will expose your panic. Your tone will expose your insecurity. Your speed will expose your fear. And no matter how smart your words are, people will feel the instability underneath them. This is why powerful speech is not just about vocabulary. It is about regulation. It is about being able to carry seriousness without emotional leakage. It is about being able to communicate consequences without sounding hysterical. It is about being able to make a point without sounding desperate for impact. That kind of calm is not passivity, it is mastery, and people can feel the difference instantly. So if you want to command more respect, do not just work on what you say, work on how calmly you can say it, because the person who can remain composed while everyone else is becoming emotionally expensive often becomes the natural authority in the room, and that is not accidental, that is psychological hierarchy in action. The calmest person often appears strongest, because calmness under pressure suggests hidden capacity. It suggests discipline. It suggests that if things escalated further, you would still remain difficult to move, and that possibility alone creates respect. So never underestimate the force of a calm voice. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is lower your tone instead of raising it, speak slower instead of faster, and let your composure do what volume never could.
Say less, mean more. One of the most Machiavellian communication skills a person can develop is this: the ability to say less and mean more. This is a rare skill, because most people live in verbal excess. They talk too much, reveal too much, react too much, explain too much, and by the time they finish speaking, the force of what they were trying to say has already died. Why? Because too many words can dilute power, especially when those words are not structured. A leader understands that words should not be spilled casually. They should be placed strategically. Each sentence should carry weight. Each statement should feel intentional. Each phrase should land with consequence. This is why some people can say one sentence and it stays in your mind for days, while others talk for 20 minutes and leave nothing behind. The difference is not always intelligence. Often it is compression. The ability to compress meaning into fewer, sharper words. Machiavelli's mind worked like this. He understood that powerful messages are often not long. They are clean, they are memorable, they are precise, and they often carry a slight edge of finality. Listen to the difference. A weak speaker says, "I just feel like maybe we should reconsider this because there are a lot of possible issues that could come up later if we don't think it through enough." A powerful speaker says, "Short-term comfort creates long-term problems." That is a completely different level of impact. Same general idea, different force. One leaks energy, the other concentrates it. And concentration is power. This is why strong leaders often speak in phrases that feel quotable, not because they are trying to be dramatic, but because they have learned how to compress truth, and compressed truth hits harder. It moves faster through the mind. It creates emotional friction. It sticks. This is also why weak communicators are easy to ignore, because their speech has no edge, no shape, no tension, no memorable structure. It is just verbal fog, and verbal fog does not command respect. It exhausts attention. This matters deeply if you want to be taken seriously, because one of the clearest signs of low communication power is this: you need too many words to make a simple point, and when that becomes your habit, people start mentally checking out before you even finish. But the person who can deliver a clean, sharp truth in 1 or 2 sentences, that person becomes harder to dismiss. Because concise speech feels expensive, it feels disciplined, it feels like someone who is not wasting energy, and people naturally associate energy efficiency with competence. Think about the phrases that tend to command the most respect. "That won't happen again." "We move at my pace, not pressure." "If it matters, it shows." "Clarity first, emotion second." "What you tolerate teaches people how to treat you." These are not long speeches, but they hit, because they are structured, they are emotionally controlled, and they carry internal certainty. That is what gives them force. So if you want to speak like a leader, start editing your language. Cut the unnecessary softness, cut the repetitive filler, cut the emotional padding, cut the endless circles, and begin asking yourself a powerful question. What is the strongest, clean version of what I'm trying to say? That one question alone can transform your speech, because the moment your words become more intentional, your presence becomes more respected. And the beautiful thing is this: you do not need to speak more to become powerful. Often, you need to speak better. And better usually means this: fewer words, more precision, more force. That is how leaders speak, not like people trying to impress the room, but like people who understand that when your words are heavy enough, you don't need many of them. In conflict, never lose your frame. If there is one place where speech reveals your true level of power, it is conflict. Because conflict strips performance, it exposes emotional structure, it shows who is centered, and who only seemed confident when everything was easy. Anyone can sound composed when there is no resistance. Anyone can appear calm when no one is challenging them. Anyone can seem wise when nobody's pushing back. But conflict is where the truth appears. Because conflict asks one brutal question: can you remain yourself when pressure enters the room? And for most people, the answer is no. The moment conflict begins, they lose their frame, they lose their rhythm, they lose their tone, they lose their precision, and most importantly, they lose command over their speech. Suddenly they are interrupting, defending, over-explaining, repeating themselves, trying to win emotionally instead of speaking strategically. And once that happens, respect begins to disappear. This is one of the deepest lessons Machiavelli would want you to understand, because power is not only about force, it is about frame control. Frame control means this: who defines the emotional and psychological reality of the interaction? Who sets the tone? Who controls the pace? Who decides what matters? Who remains structurally intact while the other person is trying to destabilize the atmosphere? That person usually wins, even before the conversation is over. And speech plays a massive role in that, because if someone can make you abandon your natural composure, then they have already influenced your position. That is why leaders protect their frame like territory. They do not allow every disagreement to become emotional chaos. They do not let disrespect dictate their tone. They do not become a mirror of the dysfunction in front of them. They remain themselves. And that is difficult, but it is one of the most respected traits a person can develop, because when people realize they can't easily throw you off center, they stop testing you the same way. Not always consciously, but instinctively. They feel that there's a line they cannot casually cross, and that changes how they approach you. So what does it sound like to keep your frame in conflict? It sounds like this. We can discuss this without losing structure. I'm not interested in chaos. If you want to make a point, make it clearly. You don't need to raise your voice to be heard. We can continue when this becomes productive. Listen carefully to those responses. None of them are frantic. None of them are submissive. None of them are trying to emotionally outfight the other person. They are structured, contained, grounded. They communicate something deeper than the words themselves. You will not control the temperature of my mind. That is leadership, because the most dangerous thing you can do in conflict is become the emotional property of the moment. The moment owns many people. It can make them say things they do not mean, reveal things they should have protected, lower themselves into arguments they should have walked away from. And once they do, their authority takes damage, sometimes permanent damage. This is why powerful people are careful with their mouths during conflict. They understand that not every point needs to be made in the heat of the moment. They understand that anger can tempt speech into stupidity. They understand that emotional urgency often produces verbal weakness. So they slow down, they tighten their language, they reduce unnecessary output, and they choose words that preserve their frame rather than satisfy their impulse. That is mastery, and it is rare, because most people would rather feel temporarily victorious than remain strategically respected. But leaders know better. They know that in conflict, the real victory is not always in winning the argument. Often, the real victory is in leaving the interaction with your dignity, your structure, and your authority fully intact. And the people who can do that consistently become difficult to challenge casually, because the world begins to understand this person does not unravel under pressure, and that alone commands respect. Leaders speak with finality. There is a certain way powerful people speak that immediately separates them from everyone else. It is not always louder, it is not always colder, it is not always more complex, but it carries one thing most people lack: finality. And finality is deeply respected. Because in a world full of hesitation, confusion, backtracking, and emotional instability, the person who sounds decided becomes rare, and rare things command attention. Most people speak as if they are still negotiating with themselves. That is why their words sound weak. They speak with too many exits, too many safety nets, too many emotional escape routes. They say things like, I don't know, maybe, I guess, sort of, I'm not really sure. Now, of course, there are moments when uncertainty is honest and necessary, but many people use uncertain language not because they are truly unsure, but because they are afraid of the social consequences of sounding firm, and that fear leaks into everything. It leaks into their opinions, their boundaries, their decisions, their standards, their leadership, until eventually they become people who are technically present, but energetically absent. They are there, but they do not land, because speech without finality feels like speech without backbone. Machiavelli would have understood this immediately, because leadership requires one uncomfortable ability, the ability to sound settled before everyone else feels settled. That is what leaders do. They decide while others are still circling. They speak while others are still adjusting. They move while others are still emotionally negotiating. And that is exactly why people follow them. Not always because they are perfect, but because they are clear, and clarity is magnetic. People are drawn to people who sound like they know where they stand, even when they disagree, even when they resist, even when they challenge. There is still a strange respect for someone who sounds internally concluded. That is what finality does. It creates a sense of internal order. It tells the room, this person is not mentally wandering. This person is not available for endless ambiguity. This person has reached a position. And that matters more than most people realize, because in conversation, people are not just listening to your words. They are listening for your level of internal commitment. They want to know, do you believe what you are saying strong enough to stand in it? And if the answer sounds shaky, so will your authority. This is why leaders often speak in completed structures. They don't drag the sentence around in circles. They don't leave every thought hanging in uncertainty. They say, this is the standard. That is unacceptable. This is the direction. That ends here. That is not how this will be handled. Do you hear the difference? That is not rude. That is not reckless. That is resolved speech. And resolved speech creates instant psychological pressure because it forces people to meet a structure instead of swimming in emotional vagueness. This is especially important if you have ever been the kind of person people casually override. If people often talk over you, ignore your standards, test your patience, or treat your words like suggestions, there is a high chance your speech lacks finality. You may be saying the right things, but saying them in a way that leaves too much room for disrespect. For example, compare these two statements. I just feel like maybe I need a little more respect, versus do not speak to me that way again. The first sounds like a wish. The second sounds like a line. And people treat wishes very differently from lines. That is why speech with finality is powerful. It creates edges. It creates consequences. It tells people where the ground is. And people behave differently when they feel solid ground beneath your words. So if you want more respect, you must stop speaking like everything is optional. Not because you should become controlling, but because your speech should reflect that you have standards, direction, and internal structure. Because without structure, there is no command. And without command, there is no instinctive respect. So speak with completion. Speak with closure. Speak with the energy of someone who has arrived at a position and no longer needs to keep verbally asking the room whether it is okay to have one. That is leadership. That is presence. That is finality.
Uncertainty weakens authority. One of the most expensive habits a person can have in speech is sounding uncertain when they do not need to be. Because uncertainty, when overused, does not make you seem thoughtful, it makes you seem ungrounded. And ungrounded people are rarely respected at the highest level. This is not because certainty is always correct. It is because human beings instinctively respond to signals of stability, and certainty sounds stable, while chronic uncertainty sounds unstable. That is a brutal truth, but it is a useful one. Most people have been trained to weaken their own speech without realizing it. They have built entire personalities around verbal hesitation. They add softness to every sentence. They dilute every opinion. They apologize for every clear thought before it even leaves their mouth. And over time, this creates a very dangerous pattern. People stop feeling your weight. Not because you have no value, but because your language keeps lowering the impact of your own mind. You can be brilliant and still sound easy to dismiss. You can be right and still sound optional. You can have vision and still sound like someone waiting to be corrected. That is the cost of unnecessary uncertainty. Machiavelli understood something timeless. People are drawn to what appears stable, especially in times of confusion, especially in moments of tension, especially when there is fear in the room. When people feel uncertainty around them, they naturally begin looking for someone who sounds settled, someone who sounds clear, someone who sounds like they are not emotionally drowning in the same chaos. That is what leadership often is. Not omniscience, not perfection, but stability under ambiguity. And speech plays a massive role in communicating that. If your words are constantly dripping with doubt, people will struggle to place authority on top of you. Not because they hate you, but because authority requires a sense of psychological firmness. That does not mean pretending to know what you do not know. That would be foolish. It means not infecting every sentence with weakness when you do know what you mean. There is a difference between humility and habitual self-erasure, and many people confuse the two. Humility says, "Here's my position, and I remain open to better evidence." Self-erasure says, "This is what I think, but I'm probably wrong, and maybe none of this matters anyway." One is intelligent, the other is insecure, and insecurity in speech is costly. It teaches people not to trust your direction. This is why leaders are careful with hedging language. They do not remove all nuance, but they remove unnecessary collapse. They do not say, "I kind of think maybe this could potentially be an issue." They say, "This is a risk." They do not say, "I'm not sure if this is the best move, but maybe it could work." They say, "This works if we execute it correctly." Notice the difference. The second version still allows reality and complexity, but it does not sound mentally bent over. It does not sound afraid of standing upright. And that is the key. People respect upright speech. Speech that stands. Speech that does not fold in on itself. Speech that does not keep kneeling before imaginary criticism. Because the moment your words stop kneeling, your presence changes, and the world responds. This is especially important in rooms where people are silently ranking confidence, which is almost every room. At work, at school, in business, in leadership spaces, in social settings, everywhere. People are constantly assessing who sounds angered, who sounds shaky, who sounds like they can carry weight. And if your speech keeps sounding uncertain, you will often be overlooked by people far less intelligent than you. Not because they deserve it more, but because they sound more structurally believable. And that is frustrating. But it is also fixable. Because authority can be strengthened through language. You can train yourself to speak with more certainty. You can reduce verbal hesitation. You can remove unnecessary disclaimers. You can stop diluting your own conclusions. And when you do, you begin to sound like someone whose mind has shape. And shape creates trust. So if you want more respect, start listening to the places where your speech collapses. Notice where you weaken your own point before anyone else even challenges it. Notice where you shrink your language out of fear of being too much. Because often, the real issue is not that you are too much. It is that your speech has been trained to sound like less than you are. And leaders cannot afford that.
Tone is a weapon. Most people focus too much on words and not enough on tone. But tone is often where power is truly communicated, because the same sentence can mean completely different things depending on how it is delivered. And that is where many people fail. They may have the right words, but their tone betrays weakness. Their tone sounds nervous,
Their tone sounds apologetic. Their tone sounds eager to be accepted. Their tone sounds like it is asking for emotional permission. And because of that, their words lose force before they even land. Machiavelli understood that perception is shaped as much by delivery as by content, because people do not just hear what you say, they hear what your voice implies. And your voice is always implying something. It is implying confidence or insecurity, authority or uncertainty, calm or panic, detachment or desperation, strength or softness, and the room picks up on it immediately. This is why tone is a weapon. Not because it should be used theatrically, but because tone can establish hierarchy without needing many words. For example, imagine someone says to you, "You need to relax." Now, depending on tone, that could sound playful, or it could sound deeply disrespectful. Now, imagine you respond with the exact same words, "You need to relax." Depending on your tone, that could either collapse the moment or completely reset the frame. That is how powerful tone is. It can restore order without explanation. It can communicate boundaries without lectures. It can shut down disrespect without noise. That is why people with weak tone often struggle to be taken seriously, even when they are saying intelligent things, because their delivery is leaking the wrong message, and people trust the leak more than the language. That is an uncomfortable truth, but it is real. If your words say confidence, but your tone says, "Please approve of me," people will believe your tone. If your words say boundary, but your tone says, "I hope this doesn't upset you," people will believe your tone. If your words say leadership, but your tone says, "I am afraid of resistance," people will believe your tone. That is why you must train your tone if you want to command respect. And what does powerful tone sound like? It sounds controlled. It sounds measured. It sounds emotionally economical. It does not sound rushed. It does not sound shaky. It does not sound like your voice is trying to outrun your nervous system. It sounds like someone whose internal world is not collapsing under social pressure. That is what makes it powerful. And here is the important part. Powerful tone is not always hard. It is often simply unafraid. That is the difference. A lot of people try to imitate authority by sounding artificially cold or harsh, but fake hardness is easy to detect. It often sounds brittle, insecure, overcompensating, and people can feel that. True command does not need to cosplay aggression. True command sounds natural, relaxed, grounded, and completely uninterested in chasing approval. That is the tone people respect, because it suggests emotional independence, and emotional independence is one of the rarest and most attractive forms of power. So if you want to speak like a leader, stop focusing only on your script. Focus on your sound. How does your voice land? Does it sound like you believe yourself? Does it sound like you are stable enough to carry tension? Does it sound like your words are standing upright or asking to be excused? Because sometimes the sentence is not the problem. Sometimes your tone is betraying your throne. And until you fix that, people will keep hearing your insecurity louder than your message. The most respected people sound grounded. If there is one quality that makes speech instantly powerful, it is groundedness. Because grounded speech feels different. It does not float, it does not scatter, it does not wobble. It lands. And when speech lands, people feel it. They may not always agree with it. They may not always like it, but they feel it. And that feeling matters. Because respect is not only intellectual, it is visceral. People feel whether you are grounded. They feel whether your speech comes from a stable center or from a restless need to control how everyone sees you. And that difference is everything. Grounded people speak as if they are standing on something solid internally. They do not sound like they are trying to keep themselves from falling apart in real time. They do not sound emotionally slippery. They do not sound mentally scattered. They do not sound socially overactive. They sound rooted. And root creates force. Machiavelli would have understood this in political terms, because unstable rulers create unstable kingdoms, and unstable speech creates unstable perception. No one fully trusts a leader who sounds internally disorganized, even if that leader is talented, even if that leader is intelligent, even if that leader has potential.
If the speech feels uncentered, the authority weakens. That is why groundedness matters so much. And groundedness in speech comes from a few key things. It comes from emotional regulation. It comes from internal clarity. It comes from not speaking faster than you were thinking. It comes from not trying to manage everyone's feelings while you were trying to make a point. And most importantly, it comes from not abandoning yourself mid-sentence. That last one matters deeply, because many people betray themselves while they are speaking. They start with a clear truth. Then halfway through, they begin adjusting it to make it easier for everyone else to swallow. They soften it, dilute it, edit it emotionally, until by the end of the sentence, the truth has lost all of its backbone. That is what ungrounded speech looks like. It is speech that cannot hold itself. But grounded speech can. Grounded speech can carry discomfort. It can carry disagreement. It can carry tension. It can carry consequences, and still remain whole. That is rare. And because it is rare, it is respected. This is why the most powerful communicators often sound slower, cleaner, and more settled than everyone else. Not because they are trying to act important, but because they are not being dragged by every emotional current in the room. They are speaking from their own center, and center creates gravity. This is why some people barely say anything, yet everyone listens when they do. Because when they speak, it feels like it comes from somewhere deep, not performative, not flimsy, not socially panicked, but anchored. And people are starving for that kind of presence, especially in a world where so much communication is impulsive, loud, scattered, and emotionally unstable. Grounded speech cuts through all of that. It feels rare. It feels expensive. It feels like leadership. So if you want to command instant respect, do not only ask, "What should I say?" Also ask, "From what inner state am I saying it?" Because words spoken from panic feel different from words spoken from center. And people always feel the difference. That is why groundedness is not just a communication skill. It is a power skill. And once you develop it, your speech will no longer sound like something thrown into the room. It will sound like something placed there, deliberately, heavily, and with full ownership. That is the kind of speech people remember. That is the kind of speech people respect. And that is the kind of speech leaders are built from. At this point, you can begin to see the deeper truth. Commanding respect is not only about what you know. It is about how your mind arrives through your voice.
The language leaders never use. By now, one thing should be painfully clear. Respect is not only built by what leaders say, it is also shaped by what they refuse to say. Because powerful speech is not just about adding strength, it is also about removing weakness. And most people never do this. They keep trying to become more respected while still speaking in the language of self-reduction. They are trying to command authority with words that quietly sabotage it, and that can never fully work. So if you truly want to speak like a leader, you must begin to notice the language patterns that destroy presence, the hidden phrases, the small verbal habits, the subtle ways people unconsciously lower their own value every time they open their mouths. One of the most destructive is this: constant apologetic framing. Now, let's be clear. There is nothing weak about a sincere apology when one is actually necessary. That is maturity. That is accountability. But many people apologize not because they have done something wrong, but because they have been conditioned to apologize for existing with weight. They say, "Sorry, can I ask a question? Sorry, I just wanted to say something. Sorry, I don't mean to bother you. Sorry, but I think." And when this becomes habitual, it creates a dangerous psychological pattern. You begin speaking as if your presence is an inconvenience, as if your thoughts need forgiveness before they are allowed to enter the room, as if your voice is something that must first be excused before it can be heard. That is not humility. That is learned diminishment, and people treat you according to the energy you normalize. Another form of weak language leaders avoid is premature self-dismissal. This is when people weaken their own point before anyone else even challenges it. They say, "This might be stupid, but I could be wrong, but maybe this doesn't make sense, but this is probably a bad idea, but..." Again, nuance has its place. Humility has its place. But if this is how you constantly package your thoughts, then you are training people to doubt you before you even begin. You are putting cracks in your own authority with your own mouth. And once that becomes a habit,
People start listening to you through the filter you built for them. That is dangerous. Machiavelli would have understood this instantly, because language creates image, and image creates treatment. The way you describe yourself, your ideas, and your position teaches people how seriously they should take you. So if your speech keeps shrinking itself, the world will help it shrink further. This is why leaders remove phrases that communicate unnecessary weakness, not because they are trying to sound robotic, but because they understand that every repeated phrase becomes identity over time, and identity shapes social power. They remove excessive apologizing, constant disclaimers, approval-seeking filler, nervous self-undermining, emotionally kneeling language, because all of it leaks status, all of it lowers impact, all of it trains people to feel less consequence in your words, and consequence matters. If your words carry no consequence, they carry little respect. This is why leaders become disciplined with language. They do not let every insecure habit live in their speech unchecked. They edit, they refine, they remove what we can signal, and over time, this creates a completely different presence, a presence that sounds cleaner, stronger, more expensive, more difficult to dismiss. And that is the point, because if you want to command instant respect, you cannot keep speaking in the language of internal surrender. You must become ruthless about removing what reduces you, and when you do, your speech begins to sound like it belongs to someone who has stopped asking the world for permission to take up space. That is when everything changes. How to sound powerful without sounding arrogant. Now, this is where many people become confused, because the moment they begin hearing all of this, they think, so do I need to sound cold? Do I need to sound intimidating? Do I need to become arrogant to be respected? No. And that is an important distinction, because arrogance is not power. Arrogance is often insecurity wearing armor. It is noise pretending to be certainty. It is ego trying to protect a fragile center. And people can feel that too. The goal is not to become arrogant. The goal is to become internally solid. And there is a massive difference. Arrogant people speak to dominate emotionally. Powerful people speak to establish reality. Arrogant people often need everyone to feel smaller. Powerful people do not. Arrogant people speak with unnecessary contempt. Powerful people speak with clean confidence. That distinction matters deeply, because the most respected leaders are not always the harshest. In fact, many of them are deeply calm, even kind, even measured. But there is something in the way they speak that makes people understand this person is not soft where it matters. That is the balance. That is the art. And it is one of the hardest forms of communication to master. How do you become powerful without becoming arrogant? You do it by speaking with clarity without hostility, confidence without performance, boundaries without bitterness, calm without passivity. That is true command. For example, compare these two responses. Arrogant response: you clearly don't understand what you're talking about. Powerful response: that's not accurate. The second one is stronger. Why? Because it does not need to emotionally overreach. It does not need to insult to create distance. It does not need ego to create authority. It simply holds the line. And that is far more powerful. Another example. Arrogant response: I don't have time for idiots. Powerful response: I'm not available for this kind of conversation. Again, notice the difference. One is emotionally loud. The other is structurally clean. And clean speech creates more respect than emotional theatrics ever will. This is where many people fail. They think power must look dramatic. They think commanding respect means becoming harsh, cold, detached, or emotionally inaccessible. But often that is just social cosplay. It is not true command. True command is much more subtle. It is the ability to stay grounded, direct, and clear, without becoming petty, without becoming reactive, without becoming intoxicated by your own ego. Because ego makes speech heavy in the wrong way. It makes you sound brittle, defensive, needy for superiority. And that is not leadership. That is insecurity trying to hide in a throne. Machiavelli, if read carefully, was not simply teaching cruelty. He was teaching strategic control. And strategic control includes control over your own emotional excess. That means your speech should not be trying to win every room emotionally. It should be trying to establish position with discipline. That is different, and people respect it more, because the strongest people often do not sound obsessed with proving they are the strongest. They sound like they have nothing urgent to prove, and that lack of urgency is incredibly powerful. So if you want to sound more respected, do not become more dramatic, become more solid. Do not become more aggressive. Become more clear. Do not become arrogant. Become more internally finished. Because the person who is truly grounded in themselves rarely needs to announce power. They simply speak, and people feel it.
The final Machiavellian secret. People respect what feels unmoved. If everything in this video could be reduced to one final truth, it would be this. People respect what feels unmoved. That is the deepest secret beneath commanding speech. Not just intelligence, not just vocabulary, not just confidence, but unmoved presence. Because the world is full of people who can be emotionally pulled in every direction. Pulled by approval, pulled by criticism, pulled by rejection, pulled by tension, pulled by praise, pulled by conflict, pulled by insecurity. And because so many people are movable, the person who is not easily moved becomes unforgettable. This is the essence of power, and it shows up in speech more than anywhere else. When your words are not constantly bending to survive the room, people feel it. When your tone does not panic under pressure, people feel it. When your silence does not become anxious, people feel it. When your boundaries do not dissolve because someone is uncomfortable, people feel it. When your center does not collapse because someone disapproves, people feel it. And that feeling creates respect. Not always love, not always comfort, but respect. And respect is often born before affection ever arrives. Machiavelli understood that in leadership, being emotionally movable is dangerous. Because if everyone can shift your internal state, then everyone has access to your power. And once people realize they can move you easily, they stop treating you like someone with consequence. That is why unmoved speech is so powerful. It says, "I hear you, but I do not collapse because of you." That line alone is leadership. Because leaders do not need to become numb. They simply need to become less externally owned, less emotionally rented out, less available for manipulation through tension. And once that happens, speech changes naturally. You stop over-explaining. You stop defending every misunderstanding. You stop reacting to every provocation. You stop filling silence with insecurity. You stop softening truth out of fear. You stop leaking yourself in every sentence. And what remains is force, pure force. Not noisy force, not theatrical force, but contained force. The kind that makes people pause before they speak carelessly to you. The kind that makes people rethink disrespect. The kind that makes your words feel heavier than the average person's noise. That is what people respect. Not perfection, not performance, but the feeling that there is something in you that is difficult to shake. And when that exists, you do not need to constantly announce your worth. Your voice begins to do it for you. This is why some people can say one sentence and completely change the temperature of a room. Because the room is not only hearing language, the room is encountering a nervous system that refuses to kneel. And that is unforgettable.
So, what have we learned? We have learned that leaders do not command respect through noise. They do not command respect by begging to be understood. They do not command respect by explaining themselves into exhaustion. They do not command respect by becoming louder, more frantic, or more emotionally available to every challenge. They command respect differently. They speak with clarity, restraint, finality, groundedness, calm, precision, emotional control. They understand that every sentence is a signal, every pause is a signal, every reaction is a signal, every explanation is a signal, every tone shift is a signal, and the world is always reading those signals. Always. That means the way you speak is never just communication. It is the public shape of your internal power. And if your internal power is unstable, your speech will reveal it. But if your internal world becomes stronger, your speech will begin to carry something most people never develop: authority without force, respect without begging, presence without performance. And that is rare, very rare.
In a world full of over-talking, over-explaining, overreacting, and over-performing, the person who speaks with disciplined force becomes unforgettable because they sound like someone who belongs to themselves, and there is nothing more commanding than that. So if you take one thing from this video, let it be this. Stop speaking like someone asking for permission to be taken seriously. Speak like someone whose mind has structure. Speak like someone whose words have consequences. Speak like someone who has learned the art of emotional self-possession, because once you master that, you will not need to chase respect the same way again. People will begin to feel it before they even understand why, and that is how leaders speak. That is how presence sounds, and that is how respect is commanded. If this video spoke to something deep in you, then you already know this was never just about speaking. This was about power, inner power, social power, psychological power, the kind most people never fully learn how to hold. If you want more content like this, subscribe to Truth 001, because here, we do not just talk about the world, we decode power. And remember, the world listens differently when your voice no longer sounds available for disrespect. Until next time.